On a busy street corner that once pulsed with melody, there is now only the low hum of traffic and the distant echo of what used to be. This was where Jalen "Smooth Sax" Carter stood most days, his music cutting through the noise of the city, giving shape to moments people didn't know how to name. Regulars passed through on their way to work, others lingered longer than planned, drawn not by spectacle, but by something steadier and more human. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The absence is what defines this story from the start. A space once filled by breath, brass, and practiced hands now feels exposed, as though something essential has been removed. There are no opening headlines here, no rush to labels or conclusions. Instead, the focus settles on what it means when a familiar presence vanishes from a public place, and how quickly routine can turn into rupture. For many, Jalen was not just a performer. He was part of the landscape, as expected as the crosswalk signal or the corner light flickering on at dusk. In the hours after the attack, the corner became unrecognizable. Police tape replaced open instrument cases. The usual rhythm of passers-by slowed, people stopping not because they heard music, but because they felt something was wrong. News spread unevenly, carried in fragments, each version struggling to explain how violence had found its way into a place defined by creativity and calm. What remained constant were the confusion, and the growing realization that this was not an abstract crime, but a personal loss unfolding in plain sight. Jalen's story does not begin with the moment he was attacked, but the impact of that moment is unavoidable. It forces a reckoning with how visible lives can still be vulnerable, and how easily something meant to bring comfort can become the center of tragedy. The camera, metaphorical or otherwise, lingers not on the act itself, but on the stillness left behind. The silence becomes a question, one that demands to be understood rather than rushed past. This documentary follows that question. It traces the life behind the music, the relationships formed on sidewalks and street corners, and the investigation that followed a crime that stunned a community. But first, it begins here, at the place where the music ended, and where the weight of what was lost is felt before anything else is known. Before the name Smooth Sax became familiar to commuters and shop owners, Jalen Carter was simply a young man drawn to sound. Music was not something he discovered all at once, but something that followed him, gradually shaping how he moved through the world. Those close to him describe a quiet focus, the kind that comes from someone who listens more than he speaks. The saxophone became his voice not because he wanted attention, but because it allowed him to communicate without interruption. Jalen's path did not point toward stages or spotlights. Instead, he chose sidewalks, open air, and the unpredictability of street performance. Playing publicly meant vulnerability, but it also meant connection. He learned the rhythms of the city the same way he learned music, by repetition, observation, and patience. Over time, his presence became consistent enough that people stopped thinking of him as entertainment and started thinking of him as part of their day. The nickname Smooth Sax emerged organically, passed from one listener to another. It reflected not just his technical ability, but the way his music settled nerves and softened difficult moments. For some, it marked the end of a long shift. For others, it was a pause between obligations, a reminder to slow down. Jalen understood that role, even if he never framed it in those terms. He played with intention, aware that someone out there needed what he was offering. Stories about Jalen often returned to his discipline. He kept to his corner, respected other performer spaces, and treated the street as both workplace and community. He showed up on time, packed up quietly, and rarely missed a day unless something truly demanded his absence. That reliability built trust, not just with fellow musicians, but with strangers who came to expect him without ever formally knowing him. Before continuing, this is the kind of story that beyond the evidence exists to tell. If you value careful, respectful examinations of real cases that center people rather than spectacle, consider subscribing, liking this video, and turning on notifications. It's a way to support storytelling that slows down and looks closer. To understand what was taken when Jalen's music stopped, it's necessary to understand how intentionally he lived. His performances were not about recognition or viral moments, but about presence. That choice would ultimately make his absence impossible to ignore. Street performance is often misunderstood as a solitary pursuit, but for Jalen Carter, it existed within a quiet network of mutual awareness. Musicians shared more than space. They shared timing, unspoken boundaries, and an understanding of what it meant to be visible and vulnerable at the same time. Over time, those repeated encounters formed something closer to a brotherhood than a loose association. Each performer knew who belonged on which corner, and respect was enforced not by rules, but by consistency. Jalen was regarded as someone who fit naturally into that structure. He did not compete for attention or push into another musician's space. Instead, he listened first, adjusting his presence to complement rather than disrupt. That approach earned him trust quickly, especially among musicians who relied on the street not just for income, but for identity. To them, Jalen was dependable, and in an environment where unpredictability was common, that mattered. The relationships extended beyond music. Fellow performers checked in on one another, watching for signs of trouble or changes in routine. If someone didn't show up, it was noticed. If a familiar face lingered too long without playing, questions were asked quietly. These dynamics created an informal safety net, imperfect but sincere. Jalen both contributed to and benefited from that awareness, rarely needing to explain himself. There was also a shared understanding of the audience. Street musicians see people at their most unguarded, passing through moments of stress, grief, or distraction. Jalen was known for recognizing those moments, adjusting his tempo or tone without drawing attention to the shift. Other musicians observed this and respected it, seeing in him someone who understood the emotional exchange taking place on the sidewalk. Because of these connections, Jalen's absence did not go unnoticed or unexamined. The people who played alongside him were the first to sense that something was wrong, long before official answers emerged. Their familiarity with his habits, his timing, and his demeanor would later become crucial, not just emotionally, but factually. The brotherhood that had formed through music would soon be asked to help make sense of a loss none of them were prepared for. The day Jalen Carter was attacked did not begin with alarm. By all outward measures, it followed the same pattern as countless days before it. He arrived at his usual corner, set up his instrument, and began to play. For those who knew him well, routine was one of Jalen's defining traits, and that consistency made even minor deviations noticeable. As the evening progressed, a few details stood out. The timing felt slightly off, not enough to cause concern on its own, but enough to register with those who paid attention. Jalen did not linger between sets the way he often did, and his breaks were shorter, more purposeful. Fellow musicians would later recall scanning the area more than usual, not because of anything overt, but because the atmosphere felt unsettled in ways that were difficult to articulate in the moment. There was no clear confrontation, no dramatic exchange witnessed by those nearby. Instead, the warning signs were subtle and cumulative. An unfamiliar presence near the corner. A shift in foot traffic. A tension that settled in without explanation. In street environments, performers learned to trust instinct as much as observation, and that night, several would later describe an internal sense that something wasn't aligned the way it normally was. Jalen himself gave no indication that he felt threatened. He continued to play, maintaining the same composure that had defined his performances for years. That calm, however, would later be re-examined as part of a pattern. Jalen rarely drew attention to discomfort, preferring to move through it quietly rather than disrupt the space around him. What felt manageable in the moment would later take on greater significance. These early warning signs did not point to a specific outcome, but they framed the event that followed. They underscored how quickly an ordinary night could fracture, and how little time there was to respond once it did. The inciting incident, when it came, would not announce itself loudly. It would emerge from the margins of a familiar routine, catching a community off guard precisely because nothing had seemed overtly wrong. What happened next unfolded quickly, without spectacle and without warning. In a space defined by openness and routine, violence entered abruptly, cutting through the ordinary flow of the evening. There was no drawn-out confrontation witnessed by those nearby, no clear moment where danger announced itself. Instead, the escalation was sudden, leaving little opportunity for intervention or understanding as it occurred. The attack took place in public, in an area where Jalen had performed countless times before. That visibility made the violence especially disorienting for those who would later piece together what happened. This was not a hidden space or an isolated environment. It was a corner people passed every day, now transformed into the site of a crime that felt impossible precisely because of how familiar it was. Details of the stabbing are handled with restraint, focusing on sequence rather than sensation. Jalen was injured during the encounter and collapsed before help could arrive. Witnesses did not immediately grasp the severity of what had occurred, a delay shaped by disbelief as much as confusion. Street performances often draw attention, but this was different. The sound had stopped, and the stillness that followed made it clear something had gone terribly wrong. Emergency response followed, but the damage had already been done. Paramedics worked quickly, and the area was secured, but the sense of shock lingered long after sirens faded. Those who had been nearby struggled to reconcile what they had just seen with the man they knew. The same hands that had moments earlier held a saxophone were now the focus of urgent medical care. Violence in plain sight carries a particular weight. It challenges assumptions about safety, familiarity, and the boundaries between public life and personal harm. For the community surrounding that corner, the crime did not feel distant or abstract. It felt immediate and personal, as though something meant to bring calm had been violated in front of them. This moment marked a turning point, not just in the investigation that would follow, but in how the space itself was understood. The corner would no longer be remembered only for music. It would now be tied to loss, shock, and unanswered questions that demanded attention in the hours and days ahead. In the hours after the attack, the focus shifted away from the corner and toward the people whose lives had been altered permanently. For Jalen Carter's family, the news did not arrive as a headline or a statistic. It arrived as a rupture, sudden and incomprehensible. Amid the confusion of hospital updates and unanswered questions, one moment would come to define the weight of what had happened. Jalen's father was asked to identify his son's belongings. Among them was the saxophone, the same instrument Jalen had carried to that corner day after day. It was unmistakable, not because of serial numbers or markings, but because of what it represented. The bell still bore traces of dried blood, a detail that transformed an object of expression into a silent witness. In that moment, the reality of the loss became unavoidable. The saxophone had always been an extension of Jalen himself. It was how he showed up in the world, how people recognized him before they knew his name. Seeing it removed from its usual context, no longer producing sound, underscored the finality of the violence in a way words could not. For his father, the act of identification was not procedural. It was deeply personal, collapsing years of memory into a single, devastating image. Outside the family, news continued to spread through the community of musicians and listeners who had shared that space with Jalen. Many learned what had happened through messages, late-night calls, or by arriving at the corner and finding it cordoned off. The realization settled unevenly, marked by disbelief and a quiet sense of dread. The saxophone, once a source of comfort, now symbolized the cost of a moment no one had anticipated. This aftermath was not defined by noise or chaos, but by stillness. The instrument that had carried so much emotion now carried grief instead. It became the clearest representation of what had been lost, anchoring the story in something tangible and human. From this point forward, the focus would widen again, as the community began to respond to an absence that could no longer be denied. As the reality of Jalen Carter's death settled in, the response unfolded quietly but steadily across the city. There was no single moment when grief arrived. Instead, it appeared in fragments, shared posts, handwritten notes, candles placed carefully near the corner where he used to play. People who had never spoken to Jalen by name felt the loss just as sharply as those who knew him well. His absence revealed how deeply he had woven himself into the emotional fabric of daily life. The street corner became a gathering place once again, not for music, but for reflection. Community members stopped on their commutes, standing longer than usual, trying to reconcile the silence with memory. Some closed their eyes, as if expecting to hear the familiar rise and fall of a saxophone cutting through traffic. Others simply stood still, absorbing the fact that something steady and reassuring had been taken without warning. Among fellow musicians, the reaction was layered and complex. Grief mixed with fear, anger, and a renewed awareness of vulnerability. For many, Jalen's death forced a reckoning with the risks they navigated every day, often without acknowledgement. Street performance had always required resilience, but now it carried an added weight. The brotherhood that once centered on shared space and sound now centered on shared loss. Beyond the immediate circle of performers, Jalen's impact became clearer through stories. People spoke of moments when his music had carried them through difficult days, unexpected grief, or quiet personal battles. His presence had offered more than background sound. It had provided grounding. For individuals navigating hardship, that corner had been a place where something gentle existed in the middle of chaos. Losing that refuge left a gap that could not easily be filled. The reaction was not loud or performative. It was marked by restraint, mirroring the way Jalen himself had moved through the world. There were no grand gestures meant to resolve the pain. Instead, there was collective acknowledgement, a shared understanding that the city had lost something rare. The music had not demanded attention, but its absence now commanded it. As days passed, the corner remained altered. Even when foot traffic returned to normal, the energy did not. People glanced instinctively toward the space where Jalen used to stand, then looked away. The silence had become part of the environment, a reminder of how fragile the familiar can be. In remembering Jalen, the community was also confronting a deeper question about whose contributions are truly seen and how quickly they can dissipate. In the days following Jalen Carter's death, the investigation moved forward with urgency, but also with caution. Detectives were tasked not only with identifying a suspect, but with reconstructing a moment that had unfolded quickly and without clear witnesses to its beginning. The crime scene offered limited physical answers on its own. What it did provide was a starting point, one that needed to be filled in by people who had been there, watching, listening, and remembering. Fellow musicians were among the first to speak with investigators. Their familiarity with the corner gave their accounts particular weight. They could describe what was normal, what was routine, and what felt out of place that night. Small details began to matter: who arrived when, who lingered longer than usual, and how the atmosphere had shifted before the violence occurred. None of these observations alone explained the crime, but together they formed a clearer picture of the timeline. Detectives also canvassed nearby businesses and residents, piecing together movements and interactions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Surveillance footage helped establish general patterns, though it did not capture every critical moment. As often happens in cases like this, the truth emerged gradually, shaped by overlapping perspectives rather than a single definitive account. The investigation relied heavily on consistency, comparing independent recollections to identify where they aligned. One of the most significant revelations was how quickly the attack had occurred. There was little evidence of prolonged conflict, reinforcing the accounts that described the escalation as sudden. This understanding shifted the focus away from assumptions about ongoing disputes and toward the immediacy of the encounter itself. It also underscored how limited the opportunity had been for anyone to intervene once events were set in motion. As the timeline solidified, detectives were able to narrow their scope. Information shared by witnesses helped identify a suspect whose presence near the corner had stood out. This was not the result of dramatic breakthroughs, but of careful accumulation. Each detail, however minor it seemed at first, contributed to a larger framework that made the sequence of events more intelligible. Throughout the investigation, authorities were mindful of the community's sensitivity. Jalen's death had not occurred in isolation, and investigators recognized that public trust mattered. Updates were measured, avoiding speculation while acknowledging the impact the case had on those who felt personally connected to the victim. This balance was not always easy, especially as emotions remained raw. The major revelations did not come in the form of shocking twists, but in clarity. The investigation revealed how an ordinary night had narrowed into a brief window of violence, shaped by proximity, timing, and circumstance. It highlighted how quickly lives intersect and separate in public spaces, often without lasting acknowledgement. For those seeking meaning in the aftermath, the findings offered explanation, though not comfort. By the time the investigation reached its critical conclusions, the focus began to shift again. The question was no longer only what had happened, but what would follow. Accountability, consequences, and the limits of resolution now stood at the center of the story, as the case moved from reconstruction toward judgment. As the investigation reached its conclusions, the case moved into a phase that is often misunderstood as an ending. legal processes advanced, marked by formal charges and court proceedings that sought to assign responsibility for Jalen Carter's death. For many watching from the outside, these steps suggested progress, even resolution. But for those closest to the loss, the movement of the system did little to ease the weight they continued to carry. Accountability, when it came, was procedural rather than emotional. Courtrooms are designed for order, not for grief, and the language used within them rarely captures the full scope of what has been taken. The focus narrowed to actions, timelines, and evidence, distilling a life into facts necessary for judgment. While these processes mattered, they also highlighted a painful truth: justice, even when achieved, has limits. For Jalen's family, the outcome could not restore what was lost. No ruling could return the music, the routines, or the future that had been abruptly erased. What the process did offer was acknowledgement that what happened mattered enough to be addressed formally. That recognition carried its own weight, even as it fell short of healing. Within the broader community, reactions to the legal outcome were mixed. Some found reassurance in the idea that accountability had been pursued. Others remained unsettled, aware that the conditions surrounding Jalen's death had not fundamentally changed. Street performers continued to navigate the same vulnerabilities, still visible, still exposed. The case prompted reflection, but it did not deliver guarantees. The limits of the justice system became especially clear in conversations about prevention. Jalen's death raised questions that extended beyond a single individual or verdict. How does a community protect the people who give it so much without asking for recognition? What responsibility exists beyond punishment in addressing the circumstances that allow violence to enter shared spaces so easily? These questions lingered, unanswered. What remained consistent was the sense that consequences extend far beyond court dates. They ripple outward, shaping how people move through familiar places and how safe they feel doing so. For those who had stood on that corner and listened to Jalen play, the knowledge that accountability had been addressed did not erase the instinct to look over their shoulder or the habit of bracing for loss. In the end, the consequences of this case were not defined solely by legal outcomes. They were defined by the recognition that some harms cannot be fully repaired. Justice can acknowledge wrongdoing and impose limits, but it cannot measure the value of a life lived quietly, generously, and in service to others. As the formal process concluded, the story turned once more toward remembrance, toward what endured beyond violence, and what could still be honored. When the legal process ended and the public attention faded, what remained was quieter and more enduring. Jalen Carter's legacy did not rest in court documents or news coverage, but in memory. It lived in the way people slowed their steps near that familiar corner, in the pause that still followed the absence of music. His impact was never about visibility on a grand scale. It was about consistency, about showing up, and about offering something steady in a world that often felt unsteady. For many in the community, Jalen's music had been a refuge. It met people where they were, without asking for explanation or acknowledgement. In moments of stress, grief, or isolation, his presence provided grounding. That kind of contribution is difficult to measure, and even harder to replace. The silence left behind was not just the absence of sound, but the absence of a shared emotional anchor. Remembering Jalen means recognizing the value of those who shape public spaces through care rather than power. He did not seek to change the world loudly. He changed it quietly, one passerby at a time. His life invites reflection on how many similar voices exist around us, offering comfort without recognition, and how easily they can be overlooked until they are gone. The corner where Jalen once played will never fully return to what it was. But in the stories shared, in the moments people still linger there, his presence continues in a different form. Legacy, in this sense, is not about permanence. It is about influence, about the way one person's dedication can ripple outward long after the sound has faded. As this story concludes, the question it leaves behind is not only about violence or justice, but about attention. Who do we notice in our daily lives? Whose contributions do we rely on without realizing it? And how might we choose to honor them while they are still here? Jalen Carter's life reminds us that meaning is often found in the margins, and that sometimes the most profound legacies are built quietly, one note at a time.